Hi, my name's Lucy Weir, and I have just written a book, or it's just been published actually. I've been writing it over the last 10 years, so it's quite something to finally have it in print and being launched tonight in the Teachers Club here in Dublin. I got involved in the protests around the Corrib gas controversy. And I'd already been involved in social justice because I'd been a VSO volunteer for a long time. So when the environmental impact of the project became evident, I was very concerned, along with lots of the local community, about what it was going to do. And what I noticed was that there was attitude polarization, that the community became very divided. And so I was interested in exploring how we could respond to what should have brought us together, but which instead caused fragmentation. And I knew the word fragmentation from the ecological systems context. Fragmentation meaning the breaking down of natural systems, because you have interruptions in the ability for animals to go from place to place through big developments and so on. And so I wanted to see whether there was an echo in the human community.
Yeah, I'll read first because I've translated another little piece by Ruth Kerr on the European Union, which is really about...
My name is Des Derwin. I'm your chair. We have two great speakers this evening. And Ryan TD, leader of the Green Party, you're very welcome, and thanks very much for your busy schedule coming along. And Dr. Eileen Brennan from DCU St. Pat's.
So from 2010 to 2014, I wrote a PhD thesis on what I called realization as agency. The story is a long one, so I don't want to bore you with the details, but you're welcome to ask more about it if you want. I wrote that thesis, and I then turned it into this book, which is called Love is Green, and the subtitle is Compassion as Responsibility in the Ecological Emergency.
Just by way of a little introduction, Simon Reeve's ecological travelogue, The Americas, on BBC television at the moment, began at the top, at Alaska. He showed within a few shots how global warming was vanishing colossal glaciers, and then the cause of it, or one of the causes, at the top of Alaska, a great oil field, and then the Trans-Alaska pipeline, which was bringing the oil down to be burnt in the metropolis of the south. Just behind me, a few hundred yards away in Blessington Street, 100 years ago, a world-renowned woman philosopher was born. And she's better known as a novelist, Iris Murdoch, but she was an interesting philosopher. And our author this evening actually had a life-changing experience in reading her, The Philosopher's Pupil. So connections, or maybe Lucy Weir might say entanglements or attunement, but it is a funny coincidence in a way.
It's about free will, human nature, the ecological emergency, and how we can respond by stepping back from our immediate circumstances and becoming aware of what's going on while it's going on. And this allows us to attune to compassion. So that's the general gist. Love then does what needs to be done through us. That's the idea of the book. It may sound a bit esoteric, but it's actually pretty down to earth. If I had to sum it up in 2 words, it would be kind.
This month, The Guardian revealed that 20 fossil fuel companies whose oil, gas and output can be directly linked to more than 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions in the modern era. And in 27, the Carbon Majors report told us that just 100 companies have been the source of more than 70% of emissions since 1988. And this isn't stopping. There's a plan, I should probably know, to bring fracked gas into Shannon. In March, just to take one random example, Citroën launched their new SUV, and you had a choice of 2 petrol engines or 2 diesel engines. And I wonder, is an upgraded road from Westport to Turlock really necessary at a cost of 200 million? That's about a third of the annual estimated cost of free public transport. There's many approaches to grasping and tackling the urgency of climate change. Some are overlapping and some are alien to each other. The just transition, eco-socialism, system change, not climate change, the Green New Deal, Naomi Klein, Extinction Rebellion, the Green Party, Greta Thunberg. Various philosophies and concepts underpin these or are otherwise presented. New materialism, object-orientated ontology, eco-socialism, degrowth, the metabolic shift, the Anthropocene, fossil capital, feminist ecology, the meditative and compassionate way, the partly Zen and Zazen way, Lucy Weir's submission. Maria Steen, the columnist in the Irish Times, even suggested last month that the climate justice movement is a pagan cult. There are many approaches, as you see, but they are converging on one issue because it is a matter of the survival of the planet, with a deadline of perhaps a decade. There is a common realization, to use Lucy Weir's category, and a widespread one. If I may be irreverent, my favourite photograph from the September the 20th climate strike was from a Buddhist monk in Vietnam, I think it was, holding up a placard saying, "There is no meditation on a dead planet." And it really dovetails in a way with my own trade union, SIPTU's just transition, with the slogan inside it saying, "There are no jobs on a dead planet." Climate change is the number one issue for 53% of people in Ireland, a recent Irish Times poll. It is no longer denied except by a very few fools and knaves. Unfortunately, they do include rulers like Donald Trump and Eduardo Bolsonaro, and knaves such as the fossil giants who know well what the prognosis is. My name is Des Derwin, and I'm very happy to have been officiating at the launch this evening of Love is Green by Dr. Lucy Weir from Vernon Press. There may not be full agreement on the overall or long-term solution, whether system change, clean capitalism, personal and lifestyle conversion, or on the means, all these various means put forward, a mass movement, climate strikes, direct action, legislation, international agreements, carbon taxes, the nuclear option, individual conservation, consumer choice, veganism, pressure on investors, meditative and compassionate attunement. There may not be agreement on all those, but there is an extraordinary agreement on the big step needed: the reduction and elimination of carbon emissions and greenhouse gases, and growing and hopefully ever building common agency, to use another of Lucy Weir's terms, to bring about this urgent big step. In the current green publishing boom, and there is one, there are popular and there are practical books like Greta Thunberg's and Naomi Klein's. There are theoretical and philosophical books too, not so quick off the shelves, unfortunately. They come from all quarters, and even the most action-urgent currents of Marxism have theirs, such as Andreas Malm's The Progress of This Storm. There is a place for deep thought, theory and philosophy in every area, and in climate change as well. It's about climate change, the need to think about it, to reflect on it, and to act on it. it's an emergency. And there are plenty of practical books around, but there is a place in the ecology of the intellect about climate change for a philosophical work, and I think this is one that's very interesting and worth looking at. Thought precedes action, realization precedes agency, or in Lucy Weir's interesting and dialectical formulation or adaptation, agency as realization, learning from engagement. A work like Love is Green has its essential place in the intellectual and political ecology, if I can put it like that.
Dogen talks of the fear that the days and nights are passing quickly, and it is precisely this fear that we must confront in the context of the ecological emergency. Doom-laden statements about our predicament are not conducive to better relationships. We should certainly practice paying attention with a sense of deep urgency, since this is the only capacity we have to influence the situation, even if the process itself only involves minute shifts in perception. Realizing that what we are enmeshed in, we cannot escape except through death, we can come back to a moment-to-moment awareness that is free and pure and fulfilled. Instead of feeling overwhelmed, we can recall that each moment of realization contains the capacity to open and release obstructions throughout the system, and so shift our attitude to each act. In experiencing realization as agency, we come to recognize that we are more profoundly, more intimately, more enormously interdependent than we could have realized at any other time in human history. One way we can make this less repugnant is to remind ourselves that the experience of living with attention brings its own rewards, and particularly through the elicitation of an attitude of compassion to the awareness.
Love is Green is not an overtly political book. Indeed, it is as much a metaphysical reflection on reality in general, on ethics, nature, humanity and interdependence, free will, the philosophy of mind. It's as much as that as a step up to the plate of climate change. Although Love is Green expounds Lucy's original philosophical approach, an adaptation of several schools, it is not necessary to agree with more than the general thrust of this topical book and its general conclusions of the need for compassion and action. And I think that will merit support. Furthermore, the publication of a volume by an Irish woman philosopher, well, as you probably know, Lucy is a Scottish Highlander, but she's lived here for 25 years or more. It is a rarity and should be encouraged as much as possible. Zen and climate change. It sounds like a popular stereotype of Zen, a stoic and quietist acceptance of suffering and catastrophe. It is not. Lucy Weir rejects this and explicitly denies that Love is Green is that it is not simply a shallow version of Zen Buddhism. It calls explicitly for action and suggests actions. Who can object to a conclusion which goes as follows from the introduction? This leads me to consider what is elicited when we do pay attention or realize in this way. I conclude that compassion or love, and if I can interpret solidarity, is the one most substantially evident, instinctive, rational and effective attitude that emerges when we reflect in detail on our own and indeed on the universal situation that all systems are in. It is through allowing a compassionate attitude to be elicited by paying attention or realization that options for action emerge. I hope that people can have a dip into it and think about climate change and above all get involved in the movement to halt climate change. Those of you who know Lucy Weir well will know of the breadth and variety of her capacities, talents and accomplishments. The publication of Love is Green, her first book, but by no means her first published writing, is no doubt the first of other books to follow. Deep thinking, getting it down on paper and out there, doesn't come cheap. And it didn't come cheap to the author either, given the obstacles she overcame and the thickets she navigated along the way. But we are happy to offer Love is Green this evening at the astonishing value of €20. And when all the Love is Greens at €20 are gone, they're definitely gone. I would ask Eamon to say a few words. Actually, Eamon's doing the actual launch.
I met Lucy Weir, must be about 10 years ago. I can't remember, we went for coffee in, was it Castlebar or Ballina? And do you know, sometimes you meet someone and you just have a rich conversation. It's really interesting. We were talking, I'm sure, about Rossport at the time and all the travails in the world, but I went away a far better person having had the conversation than I did when I went in. I've been following her since on social media and whatnot, and that sort of nature of her communication, that nature of conversation, you can feel it in what she posts. A certain decency, not shy or not willing to be tigress in terms of standing for an idea or an argument, but she actually lives it out in my experience, particularly online, in how we talk to each other. So we met there a few weeks ago, and you mentioned the book and asked me would I review it, and I was very happy to do it, but I must admit, since reading it and realising what the work is here, I was really lucky, and I really am privileged to have had the chance to read it, because I think it's a very important work. And it relates to what, maybe because I'm biased, because it relates to my everyday work in terms of how do we communicate, how do we have a conversation about climate, how do we understand this existential leap we have to make to address the ecological crisis that we're in. So for me it was an incredibly useful read. It's great value, it's an academic book, and at €20 you will not get better value. Sure, it won't be that when it's sold in colleges across the world, which I think it will be. But it doesn't read like an academic book. I don't mean that as a criticism. I'm not an academic, I'm a commerce student, and it's readable in a way that anyone can understand. And it's important we all think and try and get an understanding of the questions and of the theory that Lucy is expounding in this work. I've been involved for 30 years in climate campaigning, and I think we all admit in the environmental movement we've got it pretty much badly wrong in how we tell this story, and how we kind of maybe for years we're putting all, are you doing the right thing? You know, shaming people, making people feel guilty, not giving people a framework within which to approach this challenge, this leap. A couple of years ago I was in Japan at a very swanky high event in Kyoto. It was Science and Technology and Society. You pretty much had to have a Nobel Prize to get in. Every single Nobel Prize in physics and chemists, they were all there. It was an amazing event. And I was there for the week just listening. It was fascinating. One after the other they said, in this incredibly difficult task they have, how do we use, what's the application of these technologies they're working on? And they said to a man and woman, actually we need a philosophical underpinning of it. They realised themselves that science will only take you so far, and actually if we just make this leap as a technocratic kind of leap, A, there'll be unintended consequences, and B, we won't bring people with us, and C, it's more complex than just a narrow numbers view of what's going on in the world.
I love the book. Maybe I'm biased because I'm involved in green politics and spend a lot of time thinking about what story do we tell people, how do we explain this ecological crisis we're in and how we address it. And actually you could spend your whole time talking about widgets or megabytes or technology or maybe make people feel guilty or you doing the right thing, and that just doesn't work. We've learned over the years in the environmental movement that actually it has to be a story that's slightly broader, richer, and it has to be in people's hearts as well as in their heads.
in my own kind of just experience, we were involved in a thing years ago in the Byrne College of Art. We were asking the question, what's the story? How do we tell this story? And we came around to very simple kind of conclusions around it's about listening to people rather than telling them what to do. It's about asking for help, admitting we don't know everything. It's complex, we'll make mistakes, we'll have to reverse engines on a couple of occasions and go forward again. It's about one of the most difficult ones is we'll have to hasten slowly, which is a difficult one for when you know the scale of the crisis. You're urgent, but if you're urgently addressing something, you might lose people and you're probably more likely to make mistakes. And we talked about bringing it back home, speaking of home, and it was very much all coming to the kind of view that actually the key to addressing climate change and the ecological crisis is winning our hearts and souls as well as our mind. And you can see that in the way the campaign has been going in recent years. There was an event in Bill McKibben's organisation 350.org. We did an event in Stephen's Green a few years ago, and it was, for the love of what would you take on climate change? It was daring to speak of love as actually a key issue in what we do now. Bobby, I saw, was in the Extinction Rebellion in Merrion Square last week, a big sign, and you go into the encampment, empathy. Bringing everyone, it involves, we have to approach this where it involves everyone. Every place matters, everyone is important. And I think this book is critical because it thinks around this issue about how we get to that level of connection and awareness and understanding and engagement. And what Lucy, as I read, saying is it's through realization, it's through that very awareness that we actually develop agency. We develop the capability to act and to come together. It is ecological in its understanding, the sense of understanding that we are connected to nature. As Tommy Tiernan said in the Abbey Theatre a few years ago when he spoke of climate change, he says, don't talk to me about the environment if it doesn't have the human being at the very centre of the whole environmental thing. Out of a comic comedian, you get the wisest, most concise assessment of what we need to do.
This book is about that. It's about how we feel and how we are aware of ourselves in this world, and how maybe by being aware and realising the connection to nature and to each other, it will help us to act. And not in a way which is all about lecturing to people or shaming people, but maybe in a way that inspires a certain sense of compassion and a sense of understanding that helps us to do what we have to do.
As I said, I was a commerce student. I was far away from Cardinal Newman's idea of a university, but I was fortunate there was a younger sister of mine who studied philosophy. First year philosophy book, I can't remember the author, it was an Irish author, and he was just describing his sense of love in a philosophical way. And he described love of a partner where you realised over time the infinite variability of the partner's mind, the sense that it constantly keeps changing. The way your mind changes to address a crossword puzzle, that similar, complete, infinite flexibility of the mind was what was a marvel that he loved in a partner. I think you can apply that to a wider context. Love of the world around us and ourselves in it and our connection to each other is similar. What I like about this book is it doesn't shy away from the science. It's pulling science in, and we're deeply complex within the systems as understood by the first and second law of thermodynamics. It doesn't shy away from the science. It brings the science in to a philosophical understanding of the bigger picture of where we are and what we need to do. And that's what the love is. It's love, a sense of presence and place, of love of everything around us and us being part of it and connected to each other as well as to nature. It's a kind of weird thing. We're going into the Anthropocene, which you would, I don't know the meaning of the Latin meaning of derivation of the word, but you think it's all about man and the woman. But actually we're moving into an Anthropocene which is realising that it's not all about man as a kind of separated out. Anthropocene, maybe it should be ecocene or something we should be talking about is where we go. My great hero was John Moriarty, another I would call philosopher, mystic philosopher, green philosopher. And this book stands with John Moriarty as, in my mind, some of the really significant thought on where we are in the world today and how understanding where we are today will help us make the next step.
Human realization is the only intervention over which we can exercise any control. Systems transformed without awareness have devastated the good of wider and wider systems in a way that systems transformed with awareness have not. The humility with which we approach this task is based on the knowledge that there is very little that we can do, given the kind of agency we have, and even this little may prove too much for us. The realness and resistance of the world, the difficulty of labour, call us towards a modesty with respect to our practices, deriving from a sober and even chastened recognition of the inevitable limits of planning and the essentially unpredictable consequences of our actions. We can also, through this realization, generate responses to this enmeshment through paying more attention to conditions that are good for systemic flow in particular states, and through paying more attention to those aspects of our systemic enmeshment that human cultural systems have distracted us from or ignored, the links between consumption and violence, for instance. Finally, we can see the importance of discernment in how we act, so that the way we act becomes the focus of our awareness of how we are graduating the dissipation of energy through our own actions.
There's a whole range of reasons, and the book explains them, why this act of realization of where we are will help us, give us agency. But there's one other one I was just reflecting on. And it comes from a variety of sources. I was in Findhorn up in Scotland in the summer at a climate change and consciousness conference on this issue. And I'll be honest, there were a lot of people there who were quite distraught. They were coming up from the Extinction Rebellion protests in London. They were really enveloped almost by the sense of the crisis. And they were in a difficult space. They were quite stressed by that and distraught, as I said. I think one of the side effects of this type of realization, this sense of awareness, this sense of connectivity and connection, is that in some ways it helps assuage some of those concerns as well. It helps us act even in insurmountably difficult odds, even in a really difficult, challenging environment that we're in, where things are not going the way we would want. I think there's something in that sense of presence actually giving you some resilience and reassurance and comfort in what is a challenging task if anyone's involved in taking it on. Yesterday, you see all the signs of things around. As it happened, The Guardian, online, look at, there was a Zen master, Thich Nhat Hanh. I don't know much about it, but it's a very good article. In some ways, it's saying the same thing. He's saying, actually, one of the reasons we can't tackle climate change is because we're not present to tackle our own challenges in our own self. And in some way, it's not just about addressing the environment, it's about giving ourselves a sense of presence and meaning and place, which actually helps us give that reassurance to ourselves, our strength to ourselves, to be able to do what we're going to have to do. It's not just about agency to act, it's about strength in that agency and comfort in some way, or support in that agency for ourselves. I'm sorry if that sounds philosophical, but this is where, if we're really seriously thinking about how we're going to address this, we have to give answers to or not answers, but share with other people, particularly younger people, a sense of how we might be able to do this.
And that's why I was interested in the book. I think it's really good. It's really thoughtful. It's quite deep, but deep ain't bad. Deep is what we need now to make the leap we need to make ahead of us.
Lastly, and I'm speaking maybe just from personal experience, but that's the best way to share and add to what, same way that you're adding to Paul Taylor's work. There was a poet, I mentioned another thing later in the Byrne College of Art, David Wyatt, poet. He was very good. It was a 3 or 4 day session on I don't know what, but the central message I was coming out it was about having that honest conversation with yourself, being really true to yourself in your own questions that you ask yourself. He always, and I cite it because it influences me, there's a poem, the Camino, poem, pilgrimage poem for the Camino. And it was really interesting because it's about taking a first step. You make the path by taking a first step. I mention that because the closing paragraph of this book talks about a step, but it talks about a step backwards, if I read you right, Lucy, in terms of it says we would do this awareness as a creative dance, quoting Eliot. And I think that's a bit like what I was saying earlier on about hasten slowly is very counterintuitive. A step back to just reflect and to be present with ourselves is how I read that step. And I was thinking metaphors for that for here because I love the Teachers Club. I was saying earlier on that I used to come here set dancing. I think set dancing is the best example of a dance metaphor because it's all 8, in and out together, entwined. You go around the houses. But as I recall, you're kind of stepping, but you sometimes step back first and then swing. And that's what I think. This is an intellectual dance, but it's very real. It's very important. It's very timely. It is exactly as you say, an important book, work for our time. Well done, Lucy Weir. Read it, everyone. Thank you.
I think that this is an incredibly well argued thesis. You can really get your teeth into it as a philosopher. So much like the great American pragmatist philosopher John Dewey, Lucy Weir takes evolutionary biology as a starting point for proposing new ways of thinking about ourselves, other living things, and the environment that both shapes and is shaped by us. Although I suspect that Dr. Weir would not be entirely comfortable with my use of the term environment in this comparison with Dewey. She might prefer some derivative of the Greek word oikos, which means home, family, or household. As she notes at one point, oikos gives us the prefix eco, which we find in a word like ecology. I will say more about the originality of Lucy Weir's work a little later, but for now I want to position her in a tradition that not only takes a rational, scientific approach in philosophical inquiry, but wants to take evolutionary biology to what is seen as its logical conclusion. It seems to me that love is green, compassion as responsibility in the ecological emergency, is also reminiscent of Dewey's work in that it offers hope, even as it acknowledges the unpredictability of the future and names the deeply troubling fundamental threat of our time. For John Dewey, the worry was that the Industrial Revolution, which was taking place in America in the 19th century, and the associated mass exodus from farms and rural households would lead to the collapse of communities and the demise of a genuine participatory democracy. For Lucy Weir, the fundamental threat that we face in the 21st century is what she terms the ecological emergency. As she explains, and I'm going to quote her here, the ecological emergency is a phrase that encompasses both the environmental crises of pollution, deforestation, desertification, mass species extinction, and climate change. And she adds, the human attempts to conceptualize that. It's not necessarily going to suggest solutions that you're going to be comfortable with, but you can't dismiss them, because Lucy Weir argues so tightly for what she wants to convince you of, and she's so incredibly well read.
Now, most people would have little difficulty accepting that things like pollution, deforestation, climate change, and so on belong together under a shared heading. But what about attempts to conceptualize or find ideas to express the impact of all of this? Surely forming a concept or idea of what is happening to our world, of the damage being done to our shared home, is a different kind of thing. Dr. Weir does not agree. In fact, she rejects all forms of dualism, including that dualism of physical nature versus mental life. She challenges us to make a critical shift in how we understand ourselves. I think this is a truly bold
and extraordinary mood. She's asking us to think differently about ourselves than we currently do. And she also wants us to revise our thinking about our relationships with everything else. So this is a truly philosophical work, and I'm not pretending I'm going to go easily in that direction, but she's put it up to us as a challenge. Following Timothy Morton, she claims that and I'm quoting from her again, the emergency is in us, and we are in it. So if your head starts to swim, it's not that this is the most obvious thing. This is the challenge, to try to think like this. I have no doubt that she would get a nod of approval from the Darwin-inspired John Dewey for her declaration that any sense that we humans have of being separable from all else is an illusion. If we take evolutionary biology to its logical conclusion, she says, we are going to have to accept that we currently misunderstand not only one, but at least two things about ourselves and our freedom to act. Now for me, this is the most challenging of all, because she's suggesting that our freedom is much, much smaller than philosophers think that it is. So she takes on the really, really big and significant thinkers in the area of ecological inquiry, I suppose you could say. And she moves along very, very convincingly, very, very gently, giving summaries of the position. And then she finds fault at a critical point, and this gives her kind of leverage to get to where she wants to be. Before we stop to consider the claim that our freedom to choose what to do, what philosophers refer to as our agency, is much more limited than we think, we should remind ourselves that Love is Green is a work that is optimistic about the resilience of our species. So even as we resist the idea that we're not as free as we think, that we are limited, radically limited in terms of our freedom, I want to say to you, don't panic, because there is a message of hope and there's a message of optimism and all of this, but there's a big adjustment that has to be made. So the work offers hope where others might give us reason to despair. Dr. Weir is especially interested in a subcategory or subdivision of human agency known as moral agency. So that's the focus of her attention, at least for parts of the book. And she defines moral agency in the following terms. I'll just quote from her again. Moral agency is the sense in which we are free to do good or evil. Still quoting from her, she says, that is to mitigate or to inflict suffering, deliberate harm, or destruction, end quote. And in her remarkable opening chapter, she takes a range of perspectives on the ecological emergency, from that of Steven Pinker right through to Paul Taylor, and she makes explicit what these various perspectives are saying. So the messages are often hidden, but she makes it explicit what these various perspectives are saying about our understanding of what human moral agency can do. So this is great work of, I suppose, intellectual archaeology, finding what's hidden in these various perspectives on the ecological emergency, pulling out what is there in terms of an understanding of moral agency, what we're able to do for good and for ill. She takes them all on. She challenges each one of the various accounts of moral agency in turn, and demonstrating great skill in argumentation as she does so, to arrive at a point where she can say what remains, if anything, of our moral agency, and in particular, what replaces it. So the relatively short answer to what she finds is that whilst we are not free to do good or evil in the sense that environmental ethicists think we are free to feel compassion, both for ourselves and for the context in which we are enmeshed, our precious oikos. So I've thoroughly enjoyed engaging with this sort of really very, very skillful way of making her case. So with my interest in philosophy, the book appeals to me. Underscoring this break, and it is a break with environmental ethics, Lucy Weir says that the thesis advanced in her Love is Green is, quote unquote, beyond ethics. What it means to be beyond ethics is then illustrated in the groundbreaking chapter 4, whose title is The Practice of Responding to the Ecological Emergency. Now, I'm not going to deprive you of the pleasure of discovering what is involved in what I understand to be the Dogen Zen practice realization, and how Dr. Weir skillfully links it to evolutionary biology. And this, I think, is the originality of the work. She's bringing East and West together in producing very, very practical suggestions as to how we confront and hopefully successfully manage this crisis. So I would simply recommend that you read the book and that you give careful consideration to what it says about the ecological emergency and how we might respond to it.
All I really want to say, and I'm going to keep this very, very brief, is thank you. First of all, in their absence, to Vernon Press for betting on a rank outsider. I've always valued the role of the outsider, both in the Camus sense of the one who questions social norms, and in the sense of the stranger in a strange land, from the Dao De Ching character, who is always outside looking in. My first supervisor was a woman called Barbara Harold Bond, who set up the Refugee Studies program in Oxford, where I studied forced migration. And even though she didn't live to see this, she would have loved the unlikelihood of it, the quiet rebelliousness of refusing to exclude. She said, "You don't get given power, you take it." That, I think, is true if provocative. We have to exercise our power, but what is our power? I wanted to thank everybody for coming here, and particularly for people from social care, from social justice movements, and people who educate and work with people so that they feel empowered. Thanks to all the people who've come from the Anne Sullivan Centre. I really appreciate it. And thanks to the people involved in ecological activism. And thanks, Eamon, who recognised that natural systems have, for instance, the power of regeneration if we can but let them, through, for instance, rewilding and reimagining the landscape and the cityscape and how we humans fit in. But if I'm arguing, as I do in my book, that the traditional sense of free will is mistaken, then how can we take power? I argue that we attune to compassion, that then love does what needs to be done. We become conduits for compassion. That might sound a bit abstract and esoteric, but this really is very simple. We do it every time we make a connection with another, every time we pay attention, every time we're kind. This is power. Kindness is power. Truth is power. And thanks to the yoga and meditation community who teach practices to awaken awareness. Awareness allows you to find ways to cooperate, to achieve compassionately, to win-win, to kill the ego, as we say, and pursue the common good. So thanks to all of you who've taken the time to come here this evening for this event. To you who know me, know that some of us are less than conventional, that we speak from the margins, but that the margins are the cutting edge, and that new growth takes place through questioning, pruning away accepting wisdom and asking why. So thank you so much to the speakers, to Eamon Ryan and to Dr. Eileen Brennan, who have honoured this event with us and us with their words. I'm deeply grateful and appreciative of your presence here. Thank you to my dear friend Des, and who has been a wonderful MC this evening and who organised and sponsored the launch. And thanks to Ty McFadden, the Chief Executive of the Teachers Club, who isn't in here at the moment, but who was the essence of warmth and wisdom and has welcomed us all here. So without further ado, let's proceed to raise a glass, those of us over the age, to imperfection. We are competitive creatures, and that's our heritage. Fear, grief, anxiety and anger are inevitable aspects of our lot, and the ecological emergency will threaten to raise these to almost intolerable levels. But we must, and we can, step back and channel compassion and let love do what needs to be done, and keep opening to cooperative opportunities, even as partisanship and attitude polarization clamour for attention. The truth is, there is no them and us. We are all in this together, and alleviating suffering in ourselves, in others, and in the systems that created and sustain us is all that we can and all that we must do. So thank you.
In Germany, there's this thing called what's called the Association of Women, as well as what's Eileen's involved in. The history of women philosophers who have this big conference. So there is this recognition that there is a fund of scholarship, the type of scholarship we've just heard from Eileen there. And I think events like this fit into that and should be recognised for that alone. As I said, terrific contributions from Eamon and from Eileen. And I hope Eileen's contribution is not just left after this evening to go into the sand or into the air, that it is actually published somewhere, because I think if really engaged with it, I would be really interested in hearing. Thank you to everyone coming along.
So if you want to get the book, you can get it from www.vernonpress.com, and you can also get it on Amazon. It's quite an academic book. What I would recommend is that people buy a copy of the book, share the price of it, and read it together, and then discuss it. I'm not really interested in selling lots and lots of books. I'm interested in getting the idea out there, because I think we need cooperation, particularly at this time. Okay.